All right, Jim, we're back once again.
We're back once again. Uh, it must be Friday because we're recording, right? So this one
Exactly.
dropped for Monday, right? Uh, uh,
Exactly.
and I'm excited about this one. This is gonna be really cool. So
Well, this is a huge name in the area of dangerous books, for
yes,
sure, and we'll get into it. But how much what we're talking about today just really revamped philosophy in a big, big way,
yep,
especially European German philosophy for sure.
100%.
But yeah.
Cool.
So, what are you reading these days?
So what am I reading? Well, I by the time this drops, I'll be done with Being and Nothingness, which is going to be
Nice.
apropos for kind of our grand plan here. And I'm starting C. Wright Mills, The Power Elite,
Interesting.
the kind of classic book of mid 20th century social theory, parapolitical history stuff. And one of my sons is reading it, so we're
Nice.
gonna do it together. Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about that. How about you? What are you
Nice.
reading?
So I am still in the midst of Anti-Fragile. I'm kind of slowly making my way through Goethe. I'm not really trying to just do like a fly through, so I'm just reading like a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
But I also re-picked up. I finished like three quarters of the book probably like a year ago. It's called Chaos.
Oh
It's about
yeah,
the Marilyn Manson and or not Marilyn Manson,
Charles Manson.
Charles Manson. Sorry, different Manson. And the CIA and a lot of the experiments that were going on at the time, and pretty fascinating.
Pretty
Especially that a lot of
fascinating
this is public
stuff,
knowledge, and we're like
yeah,
not freaked out about it. You know?
yeah, yeah. No, I read Chaos. It was not long after it came out. It just
Okay.
came up on my Amazon feed, and as you know, I like to read weird stuff, and it blew me away. Yeah, so that's maybe we'll
It's
do an
nuts.
episode on that book at some point.
That'd be
Yeah,
awesome. Well, that
exactly.
one just like similar to what we're trying to do in this. It shatters the illusions in a big, big way of
Yeah,
what was going on during that time. And it's interesting too, like watching a movie or the show Mind Hunters, where it's got Charles Manson in it and all that stuff, and you just kind of there's a lot going on in the background of that. So
there is a lot going on in the background. Of that. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And you turned me on to that show Mindhunters, which Jen and I really enjoyed. So
oh my gosh, man. Yeah, eventually we might have to do an episode on it just because
yeah,
the Freudian, Lacanian stuff that's in there, I mean, or Lacanian, um, are the idea of desire and the
yeah.
shifting of moral norms over time is pretty wild.
The show kind of name checks a lot of books, which at first I found a little annoying.
Yeah.
Okay. But then actually if you watch carefully, it name checks, and then what unfolds after that book is kind of the cheat code for the rest of the episode.
Yeah.
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 So
Have you
yeah.
finished it? Both
Yeah.
seasons yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
I heard yesterday that they're in talks to try to come back for a season three.
please do it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because it does not end well. It ends on this like really weird kind of just now it's
Yeah.
over, you
It's
know?
over. It's over. Yeah. Which maybe is right.
True.
So let's talk our big 4 episode strategy that we're
Okay.
beginning today.
Let's
Okay.
go.
So we're going to do something completely irresponsible, right? We are going to try to do Being in Time by Heidegger and Being in Nothingness by Sartre in 4-ish episodes. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is stupid irresponsible. Okay. Because these are, I mean, if you're watching this, I'm holding up Being in Time. This is the shorter of the 2 books, and it's a massive tome. Okay.
Yep.
One would spend a lifetime with. The strategy, though, is we're gonna tackle these texts a little differently from the way one normally tackles them. Okay, partly because there's been lots said about these things, so we might as well have our own take on it for this to be constructive. Okay, so we're gonna start out. We're gonna do the introduction to Being in Time. All right, and then we're gonna jump ahead and do Heidegger's very important section on Being unto Death. Now we'll fill in some things the listener will need to get there. So but we're going to do the introduction. They're going to do Heidegger's Heidegger's take on death and its relationship to human authenticity. Then we'll go in and we'll do the introduction to Sartre's Being in Nothingness, and then we will jump ahead and do his section where he takes up death in Being in Nothingness, and he's very critical of Heidegger there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a way of, and I think it's very representative of the differences between Heidegger and Sartre. As canonical figures of existentialism and canonical figures of 20th century philosophy. to contrast them specifically on that issue of the place of death and human authenticity. So that's our grand plan. We'll
Yes.
see. Yeah.
Well, it's similar to what we've talked about before, that some of these tomes are so long that trying to do them in podcast form would be, I mean, we're talking 20 to 30 episodes easy going through this. In fact, for our listeners, something that Jim and I have been talking about is the potential of actually offering courses on these. And so if you really want to dive into it, but I'd love to hear from the listeners or viewers, like, is this something you'd be interested in? Because we don't want to do it if we don't have people that are interested in. We like doing the podcast. So, but if you really want to dive into these tomes and spend some time with us going through it, absolutely, we'd be happy to do that too. So
you bet. And actually, I have a digital course on Heidegger's question concerning technology too, that we can, once we get the Substack up, we'll link nice. To that. Yeah. Cool. All right. So let's talk Heidegger. Okay. Yeah. And I think the first thing we have to say when we deal with Heidegger is to go with the way John Haugland, the recently late University of Chicago professor of philosophy, one of my favorite readers of Heidegger. Like, I think in a lot of ways I have kind of a Haugland take on Heidegger in a lot of ways. He claimed that he would begin all his courses in Heidegger with this one biographical remark, and it was, Heidegger was born, he was a Nazi, and he died. So, to be clear, yeah, it's true. Heidegger was a Nazi, and the more that's been revealed about that, the more texts that have been discovered, it looks worse. It looks worse. It does seem that he was an anti-Semite. It does seem that he, had some text altered after the fact to make it look better. Okay. He did maneuver to be, named rector of the university system under Hitler. In fairness to him, he was in the party for a year, got out, was sort of, on the outs with the regime after that. But after the war, never really said he was sorry about any of that. And it doesn't really seem that, like, he made this infamously bad comment about the inner truth of National Socialism, and he never backed off the inner truth part. Okay, so I think that's fair to say. So we're not looking, though I think we both agree we're deeply influenced by Heidegger. We think there are incredible insights to be drawn from Heidegger. We are not doing Heidegger hagiography here.
Exactly. In fact, didn't he at one point never apologized or made any excuses for it, but he always tried to say, like, it was an opportunistic moment for him, that he was like, well, this was just the opportunity that I had. Yeah. But the problem is, once you start to again dive into his works, you're like, oh yeah, there's clearly some fascism going on in here.
Yeah, but getting that job also required him to, like, denounce his professor Husserl as a Jew. And
not a great,
not a good guy.
Brilliant, but not a good dude.
Yeah. Okay, so, and now let me say this too. Now this is controversial, and my own view is that not Nazism but fascism is not really accidental to being in time. And we're gonna talk about that maybe a little bit today, some stuff that's going to come up, and definitely in the next episode. There's moments in there where I think you can see it makes perfectly good sense that the author of Being in Time was going to sign up for this. There's some moments in Being in Time where you're like, how could the guy who wrote this book that seems to loathe conformity, right? In many ways, not in every way, but in many ways, how did this person end up, like, signing up for the Nazis? And there's other moments you'd be like, oh, it makes perfect sense. Okay, so we're not going to take any of that back. But also I do think there are incredible insights independent of that that we can glean. Okay, and interesting too as we get into Sartre. So Sartre's a Frenchman. Sartre, was in the French army at the beginning of World War II. Was in some ways involved with the resistance. The degree to which he exaggerated all that's all controversial, but he does seem he was involved with resistance, and is a guy of the hard left. Eventually joins the Communist Party. All this stuff. So you're getting like you're getting French existentialism in the most French version, right? And you're getting German existentialism in the most German version between these two things. Like this is, I think, in seeing Heidegger and Sartre, in a lot of ways, you're seeing not just the clash within existentialism, but you're getting kind of the clash within Western civilization that was going on at the time too, right? So
Yes.
I think it's instructive that way also.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And I don't know. Do you happen to know if in the original 1927 printing of this book, did he dedicate it to Husserl?
Yeah, I believe he did. Yeah.
Okay, because my version does have that.
Yeah.
But I think this is the third printing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he did. And the text is, the way I understand it is, and I'm not a historian of Heidegger, but it was basically he needed a different universe system, but the equivalent of a 10-year book.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't happy with where this was. This is supposedly just the first part of a much larger project, but all big German books claim that for themselves.
Yeah.
It's merely the preface, 600 pages in. And so he just basically threw the thing out there. And he was still very much at the time, I think, still in ways close to Husserl, although where he takes phenomenology in this text is very different from what Husserl was doing. Right.
Yes.
Right.
Anecdotally too, it's funny. I noticed that he dedicated Edmund Husserl in Friendship and Admiration. Did not pay attention to where he was when he did that, and it's actually Todelenberg in Baden Black Forest, I was there just a week and a half ago, and that's also where my family is basically from. So
nice, yeah. So we know what side you're rooting for.
My family left.
They left
for sure.
They're definitely mistakes by then. Okay,
exactly.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna so think of episode 1 here is our attempt to explain just what the hell Heidegger is trying to achieve in this book, and the introduction to Being in Time is very, very good for that. I mean, it is a good introduction to the book. Okay,
absolutely.
The Harper Heidegger reader, Basic Writings of Heidegger. I used to really hate it because all you got from Being in Time was the introduction, and then you got What is Metaphysics, which is a lecture he gave a little bit after that. And I always thought, man, there's so much good stuff that you could get from Being in Time, that to put in a reader like that, and they didn't do it. And then when I actually went to teach this, I found, whoa, it makes perfectly good sense. It makes perfectly good sense to this introduction does really, really introduce the Heideggerian project overall very well. So good place to start. So if the listener could just at some point in their life get through the introduction to Being in Time, good start.
Yeah, and it's not super long.
Yeah, it's not. Okay, so should we get into it?
Let's get into it. Yeah. Do we want to give it kind of context, or is just start right at the beginning of the introduction? I think it does get a pretty good context, but it doesn't quite go into necessarily the differences between Plato and Aristotle and maybe some modern thinkers and what he's trying to accomplish. Yeah.
Let's begin at the beginning, as it were. Let's go to page 1.
Yep.
Right. Heidegger begins with a quotation from Plato. Okay, and I'm on page 1. Oh, by the way, we're using the Macquarie and Robinson translation, right? The one from Harper, right? Okay, I've got mine. Bought that in 1994.
Nice.
There it is. And still holding on. He begins with a quotation from Plato. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit here, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
Okay. So here's Heidegger quoting Plato. For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed, end quote. Okay. And now I'm going to continue on with Heidegger. That was Heidegger quoting Plato. Now I'm going to continue with Heidegger's gloss. So, quote, do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But we are nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being. Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. Our aim is in the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being and to do so concretely. Our provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. Okay. end quote. Kind of a whole book right there.
Yeah.
Okay. Or at least what the original plan was for the book. Okay. Interesting thing to note here is so if you look at if you go to Aristotle's Metaphysics, and where you get a lot of preliminary work, and then he kind of settles down, he gets to the question, and he raises it. He doesn't ask what is being. He actually asks what is the meaning of being, and he famously says being is said in many ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what he's looking for is the focal sense, the central sense of the meaning of the word being. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because, you've already Plato and Aristotle aware of this. You get a weird thing. If you ask what is being, you're employing the to be in your inquiry into what being is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've gone circular, or there's always this sneaking suspicion of circularity here. Okay. Interestingly, and this is really important for Heidegger's approach, is in that quotation from Plato, there's this claim that we have long been aware of what we mean by the expression of being, okay, because we use the expression, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see that, and so that's important for Heidegger, is that we are unable to come to a definition of being. We can't say what being is, okay? And yet we employ, every time we make an assertive claim, we employ the notion of being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So implicit in us as language users is an understanding of being, okay,
Mm-hmm.
of what it means, okay? Not what it is, because to say what it is going to get us, it's going to go incoherent, right? But I think this is really important for understanding what he's doing in this book. Is we can, like, the way we are going to investigate what the meaning of being is going to be investigating ourselves, right, as inquirers into the meaning of being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we, as language users, must have an implicit understanding of it. And so our only way to get any grip on the question whatsoever is to ask something about ourselves, right? Namely, what are we, such that we inquire into what being is?
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting too that because what he's arguing, I think, in a big way, is that if we presuppose a certain understanding of being, then we get entities wrong. We get ourselves wrong. We get what we define wrong. And it's interesting that he sees this as a definitional problem. Like if you can't fully define, and through the introduction, he kind of continually says, we can't define this thing.
Yeah.
So we have to figure it out vis-a-vis us. And I love the use of language, because that's a particularly human way of doing it. Well, at least the way we use language versus the way an animal might use language. But because we can linguistically, provide at least a story about something, or at least, some kind of undermining of it,
Right.
then we can do so.
Right.
But it has to be, that's why I like to be, like we're talking about, like, what does it mean to be?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's this, I find it interesting too, because part of what he's complaining about a little bit is where the tradition has gone, is that we've just decided we're going to presuppose what it means and not ask anymore.
Right.
And so like in Descartes, you end up with this kind of flip. So in Plato and Aristotle, you have, at least some kind of defining focal point of the underpinning of all reality, right? You've got either the eternal forms, or you've got the unmoved mover, something that within it, there's this perfect expression of being, but it's still not defined, and not necessarily what we like the meaning of it.
Yeah.
Whereas when you end up in Enlightenment thinking, that's very rarely asked. It's just not something that that Descartes or many of those were really dealing with.
So I think the way I would take Heidegger, and I actually think this is true throughout his career, because I think, as we'll see in a minute here, what he calls the need to destroy the tradition of inquiry into being, he doesn't actually do that in this book. And I think a lot of scholars will say that that's the whole history of being thing that you get in the later Heidegger. And I think that's probably right. But the way I would put it, like the Heidegger at least at this point, what he's saying, okay, look, Plato and Aristotle got the right question, but he thinks they gave a fatefully wrong answer to it. Or basically, the Parmenides gave a fatefully wrong answer to it, and those guys followed suit. Okay.
Yes.
So, but they asked the right question. They asked, like, what what is the meaning of being? Okay, what are things such that what is that through which things are things, right? Um, and I think by the time you get to the Enlightenment in Heidegger's view, we've just lost track of the question. We
Yes.
don't ask in virtue of what are entities. We're just obsessed with entities. Okay.
Yes.
But he does think, though, ultimately that is a symptom of the error that we can trace back to Plato, Aristotle, and Parmenides. Okay.
Which is really interesting. I mean, I think especially with, I keep you bringing up Descartes because that's just who I have in my mind, and I think he particularly was thinking of him with some of this stuff. But
Heidegger does not tire of complaining about Descartes.
yeah, exactly. But it's interesting because, like, with him, so much of being rests in reason or logic, right? And so what he's saying is like that's not even close. So when he's talking about destroying it, he's like, I think he's talking about that, right?
Yeah. Well, so think that, like, once again, this is more explicit in later Heidegger, but I think it's here too. Is by the time you get to Descartes, there is no concern for being, right? Like think of in the Discourse on Method where Descartes says, the point of inquiry now is that we will become, he says, rulers and masters of nature. That's it. Okay. It's not about what is the source of entities such that they're entities. It's what can we do? What are the entities and what can we do to control them? Okay.
Yes.
And so I think Heidegger's saying is like this error that was made over the millennium metastasizes to the point that we've lost touch. We've become oblivious to the very question of being at all. And he thinks this is what's leading to, in his view, the odious fate of the Enlightenment, right?
Yes.
Like the technological, like nihilistic consequences of the Enlightenment. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, strange way to have on your way into the Nazi Party, but okay. but yeah, but not wrong on this one. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. And so think of it like that kind of will to power that we've talked about in the last episode. As an expression of it, as expressed in the Enlightenment obsession with progress, right? Like, I don't care what things are; I care only what we can do with them. Right? Heidegger would say that's an obsession with entities, with beings, and not being. Okay.
Yes.
And so, can I draw us to a point here in the text where, I think Heidegger makes like he's talking in a way that is where he thinks like the classical metaphysical tradition has gone wrong. Okay, so I'm on page 25, 26 here. At the very bottom of 25, Heidegger says, in the question which we are to work out, what is asked about is being, that which determines entities as entities, that on the basis of which entities are already understood. However, we may discuss them in detail. The being of entities is not itself an entity. That's important. Okay, so he's like the mistake he's saying of Plato, Aristotle, right, Parmenides is when they asked what is being, they went to look for another being. Not okay. If we are to understand the problem of being, our first philosophical step consists in not telling a story. That is to say, in not defining entities as entities by tracing them back in their origin to some other entities, as if being had the character of some possible entity. Hence, being as that which is asked about must be exhibited in a way of its own, essentially different from the way in which entities are discovered. Accordingly, what is to be found out by the asking, the meaning of being, also demands that it be conceived in a way of its own, essentially contrasting with the concepts in which entities acquire the determinate signification. Okay, big mouthful. But what he's saying is like, look, whatever you think about Aristotle's unmoved mover, whatever you think about Plato's forms, okay, although the form of good I think is wonkier than Plato's letting on here. Whatever you think of Parmenides, the one, that's fine. That's great. Maybe there are such things in Heidegger's view, right? Or at least he's not ruling in or out on that here right now. But he doesn't think they answer the question. If we say, okay, what is being? And we answer it by saying, because there's this really super being over there, right? That causes all the other beings to be. Heidegger would be like, hey, that's fine science maybe.
Hmm.
but it's not asking the question he's asking. Like what is it in virtue of which beings are beings?
Yes.
Okay. So I think here it's like, so whether you have a theistic way of doing it, whether you have a Platonic way of doing it, Heidegger's saying it doesn't answer the question that he's interested in. And he thinks it's a dangerous way of going because it makes us think about the world in terms of entities,
Hmm.
which like discrete individual things and their causes, and not in this deeper sense of their being, which is very hard for us to articulate now, given where we sit in history.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And two things that uh, I'm thinking about here. One is that when he says entities, oftentimes people will put that towards either persons or other physical things, but he's also including events. Correct?
Yeah.
Like he's including entities in regard to actions and events and moments in history. These are all entities in themselves.
As my advisor in grad school, Jan Cover, used to say, everything's a thing.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Or, Wilford Sellers, cabbages and kings,
Yes.
aesthetic experiences, finger snaps in death, right, are all things. They're all entities.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it too is what's really interesting to me is that he doesn't do what a lot of philosophers do and say, I exist, but I don't have to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, why do I exist? It's
Mm-hmm.
more of like, just focus on being, just focus on what existence is. Don't worry about whether or not you could or could not.
Yeah. Well, that he will eventually, we'll talk about this. He will eventually in this text say the primary question is why is there anything rather than nothing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it's not Leibniz's question that he's asking
Yes.
there, right? It's not like why this thing rather than not, right? That he's trying to make a case about the contingency of being in general. But let's hold on that, right?
Yeah, that's later on. Yeah.
Okay, so the problem. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
something that, and this goes back to page 2 earlier on. I thought that it was really interesting that so the second paragraph, and he's kind of talking particularly about Plato and Aristotle and how they really asked the right questions, but didn't really dive into actual investigation. Basically, is what he's saying. And then he goes into some of the presuppositions that we have in philosophy, particularly the ones that he's going after.
Yeah.
And it says, on the basis of the Greeks' initial contribution, so this is kind of what we're talking about, of like the trajectory of what Plato and Aristotle thought of being and what ends up in the Enlightenment. So it says, on the basis of the Greeks' initial contributions towards an interpretation of being, a dogma has been developed which not only declares the question about the meaning of being to be superfluous, but sanctions it complete neglect.
Yeah.
It is said that being is the most universal and the emptiest of concepts. As such, it resists every attempt at definition. So what he's saying basically is kind of what we've been explaining here, is that you've got this situation where now they don't even care, right?
Right.
It's and the fact that he said it's the most universal, but yet the most empty, the emptiest of concepts. Whereas he's saying like, it's so necessary that everything falls apart if you don't have the right definition of the meaning.
Yeah, and because his point, like his bigger picture here, is because we've lost touch with this question, is why he thinks we're wrecking the world.
Yes.
Right. Because we only see beings and we don't see being. Right?
Yes.
Right. We only see the entities and we don't see the source. We're not even concerned with the source. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think he has? Which again, I read this whole book probably 6 years ago, probably.
Yeah.
But this is my first coming back into this book, and I can't quite remember if he has an ethical concern about the way that materialistic science works, or if it's more the way we see things or the more way we understand things.
Yeah.
I don't remember if there was much of a moral inquiry into this.
So Heidegger claims resolutely, as it were, to have no ethics in being and time.
Okay.
Which is, when you read the book, it's like complete bullshit. Like, I mean,
I was going to say,
it's very hard. Even though he says like the difference between ordinary everyday Dasein, as we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, and authentic being of Dasein is not an ethical distinction at all. It's whatever, right? Okay, and And it does seem like that there is an ethic behind this, and that he does think modernity has gone very, very wrong. Like both,
Yeah.
it's come to misunderstand itself, but also, Heidegger, once again, he doesn't like industrialization. He doesn't like capitalism. He doesn't like communism either, right? He thinks all the options for modern ideology are fundamentally dehumanizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Around this time period, he talks about how we've got this terrible choice between Americanism and Bolshevism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay, now once again, this kind of makes him fascist curious, right? Okay, but he sees modernity as a terrible mistake, but he thinks the original source of that mistake is in the history of metaphysics, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
because I mean, if he's concerned about, I mean, within his very question of, in order to define being, you have to be a Dasein, right? You have to be something that can recognize the fact that we can ask this very question. You have to be within it.
right,
That to me already implies a certain kind of personhood, which means you do have an ethic of some kind, right?
yeah, yeah, right,
I mean, there has to be a
yeah,
care for the person if that's
yeah,
there.
yeah. And also going to your point though, he makes this point about look, um, something's gone really wrong here. We don't ask the right questions anymore. But then he does say this dogma came up about how being is the most vacuous concept.
Mm-hmm.
Note, he notes here in the text, Aristotle, Thomas, they say, well, it's not a category. It's
Yep.
not a concept at all, right? It's a transcendental. And ultimately it's something about which we can really say nothing because it applies to everything. It's real, but it's vacuous on that view. Later, Kant will say, it's just vacuous, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And Heidegger is saying there's a point to that. There's but the point was to think when you go looking for being, you're looking for something you can draw under a concept.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the problem. For Heidegger, the fateful error was when Parmenides said to be and to be thought are the same thing, and Parmenides did not mean there like a Berkeleian idealism. What Parmenides meant there is to be and to be understood, right? To be such that we can draw a concept for it, that we can put it into a system of logical inference, are one and the same thing. And Heidegger thinks that was where we missed being precisely. Okay. And then he does say, look, but there's a problem now. So if we're going to investigate something, we have to know what we're looking for. That you always have to have a vague, inchoate concept to go looking for something. And he says, so in very good German way, he says, in order for us to have an investigation, we have to interrogate something.
Yeah.
Okay. But as soon as we say we are interrogating something, we're presupposing being now,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're presupposing what we're looking for. Okay. So then what is it that we should interrogate? Right?
Yes.
What can we, I love the interrogation thing too. Right?
Yes.
Okay. What shall we interrogate? And that's where he then brings up Dasein for the first time in the book. So I'm over on page 27 here. Okay, sorry, I jumped ahead on you there.
You good?
Very top.
Yep.
He says, thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity. So we've got to look at an entity here, right? The inquirer transparent in his own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being. And as such, it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely being. The entity which each of us is himself and which includes inquiring as one of its possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein, being there, right? If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give proper explication of the entity Dasein with regard to its being, end quote. Okay, so what did Heidegger do there? He's saying, look, if we're inquiring after being, and so it's a phenomenology of the metaphysician is what this book is, right? So if we are inquiring after being, we must have an implicit understanding of being, not a concept, but an implicit understanding of it. Okay. So the only thing that we can then interrogate is Dasein, is the inquire into being. Okay. And he's going to say quite famously here in a little bit, what is Dasein? Let me find it here. I'm over on page 32.
Mm-hmm.
Second paragraph there, the one that everyone has highlighted in his or
Yeah,
her edition.
exactly.
Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities. Rather, it is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. But in that case, this is a constituent state of Dasein's being, and this implies that Dasein in its being has a relationship towards that being, a relationship which itself is one of being. And this means further that there is some way in which Dasein understands itself in its being, and that to some degree it does so explicitly. It is peculiar to this entity that with and through its being, this being is disclosed to it. Understanding being is itself a definite characteristic of Dasein's being. Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. End quote. Okay. And now note when he says Dasein has understanding of being, we have to be careful because like the German word there is very specific. Like he's not saying understanding in the sense of like Dasein could draw you a picture of being. Like Dasein could give you a concept for it. So he's saying like Dasein in what it does has an implicit understanding, right? A grasp of being. And so our only way to get the question off the ground is to ask, what are we such that we are the kind of being that would care to get this question off the ground?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And basically, I kind of want to go back just a few sentences. That's actually just on the previous page 31.
Mm-hmm.
He gives a case as to why, especially he uses the word ontically as opposed to ontology, which is interesting. But down in, let's see, third paragraph, and it's italicized actually.
Yeah.
But basically, all ontology, no matter how rich and firmly compacted a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains blind and perverted from its own most aim, if it has not first adequately clarified the meaning of being and conceived this clarification as its fundamental task.
Yes.
I just find that interesting, especially as he's explaining Dasein. Like if you're trying to give an ontology to something, but you don't understand the ontical reality of it, really, that's what he's saying, that you're going to be off.
Right.
I love too that he says like no matter how good your system is with its categories, because he's also talking about Aristotle right there.
Yeah.
He's like as much as you categorize things and put things in genus and species or whatever it might be, if you screw up what the meaning of being is, all of that is now prepositionally wrong.
Yeah. This is the stakes here is like for Heidegger, if our categories are going to have any grip on the world outside of us, they have to begin in an implicit understanding of being.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And so like without grasping the meaning of being, he thinks we're always kind of like, to use a phrase from John McDowell from a different context, spinning frictionlessly.
Yes.
Right? Like we're telling a story to ourselves about ourselves. Okay. And that's why we need like philosophically we need a story about being, right? And then I think, as you point out, ethically, he thinks we really need one too, because we're going to destroy us in the world with us if we don't reconnect with being. Which not wrong there, yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, and so a couple things about that word Dasein, right? It's literally Dasein means literally being there, okay, being in a place, okay. I think but in German it can mean existence, like it's all over Hegel too, but used differently, okay. In the sense, like one might say, like the existence of the poor or the existence of the student, like existence in the sense of like a way of life, right? Like okay, and you can see like what Heidegger's saying is like only a certain kind of being is there in the sense of having a sense of its place, right? Like having a sense of where it is, right? Asking where am I, right? Or as we'll see here, when am I? Okay,
yes,
okay, does that make sense? And okay, now I think an important thing about this though is, which maybe goes unnoticed here, is so we can only ask the question of being in asking it through a question about ourselves as people who, or things, entities that ask questions about being. Okay, so think of it then like Heidegger's phenomenological universe in being and time then in many ways is entirely immanent now,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
So I mean, like there's no getting outside of the world of Dasein,
Yes.
right? Like we're limited. So I think this is the implicit atheism of this book. Like there's nothing coming to Dasein's rescue because the whole purview that we can take is only mediated through Dasein.
Yeah.
You see my point?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And so I think
Yeah.
like
And
right
Dasein,
there, yeah.
Dasein has to be disclosed too, right? Like it has to be. That's part of the reasons why it's the metaphysician that can really get into this inquiry, because the metaphysician himself self-discloses his own Dasein. Correct? I mean, like that's
Right.
it's something that
Yeah.
you couldn't do that with another entity other than
Right.
a person.
Right. Right. Or at least I think what Heidegger's saying is the confusion of all prior metaphysics, right? And for him, everybody's been wrong till him.
Yeah.
The confusion of all prior metaphysics is that it didn't realize what it was doing was self-disclosure.
Yes. Exactly.
Right. Like that's okay. But no, everything we do then is self-disclosure. And that's why I think there is this kind of, it's borrowing a word from Sartre, but we'll do that, right? There's a kind of abandonment from page one of this book. Like
Yes.
Dasein's here. Dasein's thrown in this world, and Dasein does not really have a perspective beyond itself until death shows up, as we'll see later. Right.
Yes.
But even then, it's not. It's a perspective of nothing, not something. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that he because of his I don't know how to say it, kind of impertinent imminence, if you will. I guess like it has to be imminent. Then I think to me that already sets him in a different class or category than what his project is, right? So like Plato and Aristotle both have something out there that can help define what we're talking about. And then with somebody like Descartes, it might be something like within, whereas he's saying it's a constant immanent or constant immanence, if you will, right? So even then, the categories of things like unity or transcendence, even those kinds of things, kind of fall apart a little bit
or fall back into Dasein.
Or fall back into it. Yeah, but it's a constance to it. That's interesting.
Yeah, because when he says like ontically, what are we? What he means there is sort of like what not at the most abstract level, but like what in the nitty gritty makes us different. Well, it's because we are beings for whom being is an issue. Okay.
Yes.
That we and meaning we have a stance on our being. Okay.
Yes.
But notice then that there, although Heidegger doesn't like the subject, the word consciousness barely shows up in this book. Right. There is alienation is the wrong word, but there's this sense in which we can only get to things through ourselves once we become reflective, right?
Yeah.
Once we become reflective. And though he doesn't think the ordinary every way of being for Dasein is reflective, right? But in as much as we're inquiring now, we've gone reflective and we're looking at Dasein looking at itself, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. This is why, like, one of my favorite paintings is Caspar David Friedrich's The Woman at the Window, where
nice. Yeah.
Which it's on the cover of one of my books, and it's because you have it is the image of the human that's obscuring us from seeing the thing.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Right.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so in the same point, like we'll get into this, he doesn't really give us an argument for it here, but it's going to unfold later when we talk in the next episode. That he ends up saying that for Dasein, there's the title of the book, there's no separating being from temporality. Okay. Like Dasein will always find itself posing the question of being, having come from somewhere or somewhen, right? And going to somewhere else, to the future, right? We're always in a historical moment. We're always in the stream of time, right? And there's no framing the question for us that isn't in that, okay? And that's where he starts to play, I think, brilliantly on this word present, okay? Because present can mean a lot of things. It can mean spatially here, right? It can mean now, right? It can mean like it's actual as opposed to merely possible, right?
Hmm.
All these things, and he means all of these, right? But what he wants to say is presence. So like Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, the whole tradition saw the present, right? What is present as what is primary metaphysically. Okay.
Yes.
And what Heidegger is saying is that is but one moment of time, right? And the present is only stretched between the past and the future. And there's no privileging. He's going to actually argue just the opposite. There's no privileging the present over the sweep of time, right?
Yes.
And this, once again, you get like this is kind of the immanence that he's going to argue for in this book, because Dasein, for Dasein, to be is to be in time. Okay.
Yes.
For us, all right. There is for Heidegger the sense that like whether we have an atemporal possibility or not, it is not something that is available as a possibility for Dasein to contemplate, because to be Dasein is to be in time.
Yes.
Right.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean,
and so okay, so that comes up. Well, so right before we're in section 6, he says, okay, here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you. It turns out being and time are the same thing. Okay.
yes.
That's sloppy. Sorry, but they are inseparable for Dasein. Dasein is a temporal being. Okay, but then think of it. Then for us, our answer to the question of the meaning of being will be temporal.
Yes.
Okay, meaning it's what's going on now, right? And then we get what he calls the task of destroying. The task of destroying the history of ontology. Okay, and this is where he says well, interestingly, he begins with talking about how Dasein always inherits a past. Like we're thrown into a world, we take up a past because we're temporal beings, we're historical beings. We take that past up and we move forward with it, right? It's what we stand on. Okay, this is Heidegger's like inherent conservatism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what he says though is like the past can become calcified, right? And it can accumulate, and so that it hides the original, right? So like Heidegger has this vision that there was an original insight into being, right? And then certain mistakes get made, and then we have this long tradition that's sort of masking that original insight. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so Heidegger's view is like this has to be this tradition has to be destroyed. Okay, it has to be deconstructed. That's one of the places where that notion comes from. It has to be deconstructed to find that original insight that was there. Okay.
Yes.
And so he says this has to be done. He doesn't do it in Being and Time. This is something that's basically done later in his work. Okay. But that's what he's saying is like we need to retell the history of philosophy that in a way that liberates us from that history and lets us see where the primary error was. Right.
Yes.
Right.
Which is very different than the Enlightenment skepticism that was going on. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very different task, almost completely.
Yeah.
Like,
definitely.
Because I think like what Descartes and those who followed were skeptic of the tradition in the sense of, I don't want to rest on the laurels of what came before me. I want to start from a blank slate, right? I want to start from that area. Whereas he's saying, no, the question was wrong.
Yeah.
Way ahead of us. There was an insight there.
Yeah.
And so it's not really like a skepticism in the sense of the Cartesian style.
Right.
It's more of something was wrong. So it's not really, he's not a skeptic necessarily.
No. And we have to admit it's our past. So I mean, Heidegger taught, gave thousands of pages of lectures on the Greeks. Right? I mean, okay. Because so he's not saying, hey, let's go sit in our study and see if we can imagine a world where Aristotle never lived. Right.
Exactly.
Okay. And we could just sort of imagine our way out of these errors. Okay.
Yes.
What Heidegger is saying is, Parmenides' mistake, Aristotle's mistake, Plato's mistake is constitutive of our Dasein.
Yes.
It is constitutive of us as inquirers. Okay. He thinks it's a mistake, But we cannot understand ourselves as inquirers until we rehearse that history, okay, with an eye to the errors, okay, and then we can move forward in a reflective way, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two ways of going wrong for Heidegger. Like one would just be unreflectively accept the tradition, be a good devotee of your favorite historical figure, right? The other way to go wrong is to go Descartes and say, well, we're just going to like just make a break, man. We'll just like,
Yeah.
if this is fair to Descartes, but like, okay, right. We're just going to make a break and we're going to move on. And now we've got science and now we've got, method, and we won't make mistakes anymore. So we don't even need to understand this. And Heidegger would say that is not a possible human act.
Yes.
Right. That is not a possible human act. So we need to understand our erroneous history for Heidegger. Right. We need to go through the process of the destruction of the history of metaphysics.
Yes. Well, it's similar to what you and I say to each other a lot, that you don't get to choose your Dasein.
You do not.
Right?
There's one thing I know, man. You don't choose it. Yeah. Right.
So in order to understand your current temporal reality, you have to understand the history of the entities within their temporal realities.
Yeah.
Right. Because
exactly.
it builds on itself, although it's consistent, right? Or constant, right? Because especially intellectual information, it's always going to build on something. I mean, even,
right.
Where you're from is going to form you in some way.
Right.
So the being there, so me being in Texas, born in the 1900s, is going to form me in a certain way, but it's 1900 years before that that leads me into that moment in time.
And so, and this brings us to another important point it's going to be important that we track as we go to Sartre later. Is he says this at some point in the introduction, and it's certainly a theme throughout the entire book, where Heidegger says, look, okay, so on the one hand, you're thrown into a tradition and you're going to, and don't think you're going to like bootstrap your way into Cartesian certainties or anything like that. Okay. Yep. But he does say only Dasein exists. Okay. Where he means something very specific by existence. And then what he means by that is it's basically the existentialist motto that existence precedes essence. Now, for Heidegger, that's very complicated, right? And he does kind of say something like that later in the book, okay? But what he means here is, okay, we're born into a language, we're born into a cultural moment, et cetera, but that is up to us at some level. Those are Dasein's doings, because once again, like he's in this immanent world, right? Like it's all our doing, okay? And only Dasein can take responsibility for its being, right? Because being is an issue for Dasein, it's only Dasein that has the possibility of taking responsibility for its being, right? Do you see that? Okay, and that's when he says like Dasein exists. What he means is he doesn't mean literally like you ever existed without having a historical moment that you were in. But what he means though is that historical moment in a sense is up to you, and that you can own it or not own it. Right.
Yes.
Do you see that? And so that notion of, like, I like to put it, owning it is an important concept in here. Okay. For Heidegger. Right. And so it like basically thinks is like, we're born into these possibilities, and which of those we realize, right, is indeed something that is up to Dasein. And remember, by Dasein too, he doesn't just mean you and me as individual Daseins. He also means, I think more importantly for Heidegger, he means things like cultures.
Yes.
This is Hagelin's take. Like for Heidegger, Dasein is, it might be chemistry, right? It might be jiu-jitsu, it might be Catholicism, it might be, socialism, it might be, being an American, being a German, being a Frenchman, all these things. And these things have to be maintained, right? They have to maintain themselves. And that's what he means by only Dasein exists.
Yeah, and it seems like
if there's going to continue to be Americans, we have to do it.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And that it seems to me like he's also encouraging similar to what we talked about in a previous episode, of think for yourself, but you're also within a tradition, right?
Yeah.
Because to be able to look
Yeah.
at the Dasein you've been thrown into is
Yeah.
to critique it too, right? To kind of think about the
Mm.
pieces of it.
Yeah.
Um,
That one I actually would disagree on.
okay,
Like that, if there's any critique in your Dasein, and we'll see that next week. Okay,
interesting. Okay,
and this to me is one of my biggest worries about Heidegger, right? On the
interesting. Okay,
fascism. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think the think for yourself thing. I think this is a very in some way in some ways it's anti-Kantian. Well, it's anti-Kantian in a lot
okay,
of ways. In some ways it's pro-Kantian, but I think in some ways like that idea that you're going to like hold out your Dasein up to the light and decide for or against it. That's Sartre. Okay.
okay.
Right. I don't think that's Heidegger. Right.
Interesting.
That's
Okay,
what, yeah. Yeah.
that's awesome.
I don't mean to be snotty there, but yeah.
No, that's
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think
which
that
is
issue
where
is
to me, I
Heidegger.
think.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that to me actually underlines then a little bit of why he was probably cool with the Nazi movement, because it's this major that we're all gathering together, going in the same direction, and we've all got this desire to be our glorious Daseins, right?
Let's own it, man. Let's own it. Let's own what we are.
Exactly.
You know what you are. Own it.
Yes.
Let's keep it. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think this is why Sartre and Heidegger creep each other out. I think, Sartre's clearly a reader of Heidegger, an admirer of Heidegger. Heidegger's all over being and nothingness, no doubt. Okay, but Heidegger wrote the letter on humanism.
Mm-hmm.
That's a letter, not an essay, because he wasn't allowed to publish because of the denazification stuff after the war. But he wrote a letter on humanism at like separating himself from Sartre.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think this issue is one of the things that most creeped these guys out about each other. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
the front of yeah. So we'll do so, and this is kind of a good segue next time. What we're talking about right here is like what does it mean to be reflective about your Dasein? And once you've done that, what do you do with it? That's where death comes in for Heidegger, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, in an important way. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Anything else on the intro?
I mean, we could go on and on and on, but
yeah.
We should probably, yeah. I mean, hopefully we've given people, hopefully we've sown more clarity than confusion, but we'll see.
Yeah. Highly recommend reading the intro though.
Yeah.
100%. And I really like his section on the concept of logos, but I don't know if it's necessarily interesting to get into right now.
We didn't do any of the phenomenological method stuff.
No. But if you really want to understand what his project is, to get into the phenomenological method makes a lot of sense, right?
So can I just make one quick point that I think will be important?
Yep.
We should mention. So what is this comes towards the end of the introduction. Like Heidegger says, look, we got to investigate Dasein. Eventually where I'm going here is we're going to see like you can't take Dasein out of history. Okay. You can't take Dasein out of time. He then talks like how his phenomenological method and how it's different from Husserl's is what he's doing there. Right. And then he says like, what we're going to find though, is there is the everyday ordinary Dasein. And then there's authentic Dasein. Okay. And so like where authentic means bona fide, the real deal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But also there's other words that could be used there, and there's kind of an ethical thing going on there, right? Like, like, okay, committed Dasein that's really committed. And so he wants to talk about like, there's two modes of the being for whom being is an issue. There's the inauthentic everyday version, and then there's the committed version. That's how I like to read authenticity here. There's Dasein that is committed to itself, right? Mm-hmm. And there is where reflective thought has come in.
Yes.
Okay. And he does say like this central distinction between two modes of Dasein is important for the rest of the book. So I think we need to note that in the introduction, because that's what we're going to explore in the next episode, right? Because that's where it's like what makes for commitment for Heidegger, what makes Dasein committed to itself is its confrontation with death.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Isn't it awesome? Yeah. And then eventually Sartre will say, the hell it does. Okay.
Well, it's so funny, man, because I have a lot of intellectual respect for what Heidegger is doing here.
Oh, yeah.
But I can't help but in my head disagree with some of it. And I don't know Sartre as well as you do. Obviously, I haven't read all of Being and
Yeah.
Nothingness, but I'm wondering,
Yeah.
is Sartre really where my mind is actually going? Is
Yeah.
that
You're
like
having a moment
where
like, I thought I was a Heidegger guy, but am I a Sartre guy?
exactly, exactly?
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and it's
I've been
odd.
having that moment for a lot. Like, yeah. Right.
Well, it's an odd thing too because I am naturally kind of an anti-conformist, and so
Yeah.
when I hear something like you have to confirm or not confirm, but commit
Be
to a
committed.
certain kind of Dasein,
Yeah.
I kind of like the hell I do. I like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. 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 I know.
So it's hard. It's hard. But his project here, though, especially for me, the interesting part of it is where did the question get wrong, and
Yeah.
how can we make a
Yeah.
corrective lens on that? But then also the other side of it, of the temporality of Dasein, is very interesting to me. That it's and again, he's obviously an atheist, but it's still an interesting inquiry, and to get into if being is not something external or not something that just grounds reality and we don't have to worry about it, then what the hell is it?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, yeah, and we have to be careful with, and that's me misspeaking, like calling Heidegger an atheist, because I forget where it is. At one point he says, when asked, are you an atheist or a polytheist or a monotheist, he says, I will leave it to the gods to count themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, he did want a Catholic funeral, right? So
he did want a Catholic. Well, he wrote a letter to a bishop and he was given a Catholic funeral. We have no idea what he asked.
Right? So, that's true.
Right.
Well, I think that's where his love of his conservative kind of ritualism is still a good thing, regardless of what he might define as God. Right.
Yeah. And the thing with Heidegger, the Heidegger of Being and Time, I think it's a much more imminent world for Heidegger to be in time than the later Heidegger. I think he's much more open to a kind of re-enchanting of reality and things like that later on. Okay. And I think though in Being in Time, as we're going to see, for him, it's like if you're thrown into Catholicism, okay, and you then become authentic Dasein, then you own Catholicism. Mm-hmm. If you're thrown into, Hinduism and you become reflective Dasein, then you own your Hinduism, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. He's not ruling in on what he calls the existential, which is like the particular commitments one might have. Mm-hmm. If for him, he's concerned with the existential is like what it would be to be committed, right?
Yes.
It's the ontological distinction again there, right? I think that's important to know for him, right? And another thing too is like I've been like, kind of pretty nasty to old Martin here in this episode, but like Being in Time is one of the books that's most influenced my thought. Like once again, I bought that copy on my desk right now. I bought it in 1994, right when was I a sophomore in college, junior in college. Bought that book. I've read it regularly throughout that ever, right? And there's parts of that book that really, really relatively late in my career now, like changed how I think about cognition and lots of philosophy of mind stuff. I think at the end of the day, my preferred existential phenomenologist is Merleau-Ponty. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I kind of like like for me, Heidegger and Sartre it's like watching a cockfight. Yeah. It was like watching them tear each other up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I do think there's a tremendous value to Heidegger. I think there's tremendous value to that book, though there's some downsides too. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's always worth reading someone, even if you disagree, right? You have to be willing and open to change your mind, depending on the points.
There's much I agree with too in the book.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, and he provided this question in a way that kind of sent a pretty major upending of a lot of philosophy going on in Europe at the time. So
one of the great embarrassments to like Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and de Beauvoir, the French existentialists, is that they had this huge debt to Heidegger, which is their sworn enemy, right? And like good luck turning a page in the Phenomenology of Perception by Merleau-Ponty without a reference to Heidegger. Good luck turning a page in Being and Nothingness without a reference to Heidegger, right? So like those projects do not happen without Heidegger, right? Yep. They don't, right? And as we'll see, I think is what he does with the they self and inauthenticity. There's something to it, 100%, right?
Yes.
But I'm not going to join the party.
Exactly. Yeah, that's hard to negate for sure. That's firmly within him, even though he tried to excuse it away, but just not.
Yeah. And as we'll see too, is I don't know who's right. I think one of them's right on death.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't know which one. I'm very open here. So
that's awesome. Well, good episode, man.
Yeah, it's fun, man.
Yeah,
it's fun.
That was fun. We got real deep real quick. So
Yeah,
awesome.
So
as one does with Heidegger. I mean, that's
yeah. There is no shallow end of the pool.
Exactly.
Jump in.
Yep. Well, all listeners and viewers, be sure to like and subscribe. Do all the things you know you're supposed to be doing. Let your friends know about it as well. And as always,
commitment to that subscribe and like button, man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Commit. But yeah, and if you have, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, if you do have an interest in getting deeper into these works, we absolutely would be happy to offer some longer courses on those. But also, any comments or any other ideas. Maybe you're 100% Heideggerian, or maybe you're ready to hear us talk about Sartre, or maybe you've got another philosopher in mind that does philosophy of being, and let's hear it.
We are open to requests.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, great episode, man.
Thank you, man. Thank you, Jay. Appreciate your time, man.
See ya.